And obviously, why did we choose this topic? Well, it's partly based on a lot of feedback from families who ask questions like, why did it take so long to diagnose CJD? The diagnosis was slow, but the symptoms were typical, so why couldn't it have been done earlier? Or we had several other diagnoses, or he was told it was depression at first. All of these are comments that come fairly frequently from families. So clearly the perspective of families is very much their own personal perspective. And I obviously am not in a position to talk about that firsthand. And what I'm going to do today is really try to give you a sort of view from the professional angle, trying to let you in a bit on how professionals really view things and see things. And for various reasons, I'm going to relate this to sporadic CJD because there are different issues with different forms of disease, and sporadic CJD is certainly the commonest one. So the typical pathway of someone presenting with suspected sporadic CJD in the UK is that people go and see their GP, get referred to a specialist, and then the specialist hopefully will let our unit or the unit in London or both of us know. And it's not only that we as two specialist units information from people rise to those specialists. There are other ways, of course, that people follow different pathways, like sometimes people present as an emergency to hospital without going through their GP. So time, from the first time that someone has any symptoms at all to the point where they're diagnosed, people frequently say, it seemed to take a long time. Why did it take such a long time? And of course, could it take less time? And the first thing that I would want to say is, from the professional perspective, it's not a time really, it's a series of times. And the first, of course, point is where somebody or somebody in the family notices that something is wrong. People actually recognize a symptom. They then go to get medical advice. But there is obviously a gap between noticing the symptom and getting medical advice. And in general, the reason for this is because people think, well, I'll wait and see. Maybe it's nothing, maybe it will go away, or maybe there's some other explanation for this. I've got some data for 2006. It's not particularly different now, but I've got the detailed data for sporadic CJD in 2006. And the average time from when a person developed a symptom to first seeking any form of medical advice was about 2¼ weeks. It varied from the shortest time of one day to, in a few people, up to several months. This is short, but it's a reasonable thing to wait and see. So if we then go to the next point, they see somebody like a GP, and of course there is some kind of initial management, which may be let's wait and see or do some tests or whatever, and you have to wait for the outcome of that initial management. And then of course it may be that the GP says, right, you need to see a specialist, which is usually, but not always, a neurologist. And in 2006 for sporadic CJD, the average time to actually see a specialist from the very first symptom was about 6 to 8 weeks, again with some variation. In general terms, for seeing a specialist in hospital, that's not actually a very long time. Mm-hmm. You then, of course, have some investigations by the specialist, and you have to wait for the results of those specialist tests. And then, of course, at some point, CJD is thought to be possible or likely. And then again, in the same set of data that I looked at, the average time for this was about 8 or 12 weeks. And that's not necessarily a long time in general terms for somebody with some kind of symptoms to get a possible or likely diagnosis. And then, of course, at some point, there's a consultation with either the Edinburgh or the London units or both. And at that point, there's quite often a much firmer diagnosis. But that again, the average time for that was about 12 to 16 weeks. And then, of course, there's a final clinical diagnosis. And in 2006 for sporadic CJD, the average time from the very, very first symptom to the final clinical diagnosis of this is CJD, sporadic CJD, it was about 3 or 4 months. Now, that's not that different from the diagnosis of many neurological illnesses. And in fact, for some, this would actually be a relatively short period of time to get a final clinical diagnosis. So what is the problem? Well, of course, the problem, as many of you will know, is that sporadic CJD is usually a very rapidly progressive disease. And if you look at the duration of illness in sporadic CJD, what you can see is that very sadly, about 50% of people die within 4 months of their first symptom. And indeed, probably about 2/3 of people have died within 6 to 8 months. So what that means is if you look, and I've chosen just 3 time periods 2 years apart, from the very first symptom to dying has been about 4 to 4.5 months. And the onset to the diagnosis is often over 3.5 months to 4 months. In other words, the diagnosis is being made on average, and this is of course an average, different individuals will have different figures, is being made very late in the illness. And of course that is one of the things which causes difficulty for people. So put it shorter. Well, if we take this first segment of somebody noticing a symptom, getting medical advice and being sent to see a specialist, I find it difficult to know how this could, or maybe even should be, really significantly reduced. The symptoms may be very non-specific, and the symptoms may have possible explanation. For example, if somebody's got impaired concentration or poor sleep, it may be that they've got difficulties of a personal sort or difficulties with work, which may explain it. And of course, some waiting is very sensible and reasonable to see if these symptoms persist, get worse or get better. It will vary very much from patient to patient. If indeed someone goes to see a GP, usually people do get to see GPs in this situation fairly quickly, although there can be difficulties there. But then again, difficulties in seeing a GP is a problem to do with the general system rather than to do with CJD. And similarly, referral to a specialist like a neurologist is not a specific CJD problem. It's a problem or a feature of the whole system. And of course, even if people are seen by doctors in the early stages, the early stages of the illness are very non-specific. So I said that the symptoms are common and non-specific. Well, for example, there could be dizziness, unsteadiness, forgetfulness, mood change, sleep disturbance. And the key feature is, although of course people with CJD do present with these symptoms, hardly anybody who presents with these symptoms will ever turn out to have CJD. I've had many, I think actually no, I've had all of these symptoms, and many of you may have had all of these symptoms from time to time. And a GP will see such presentations every single day of their working life, but they may never see even one case of CJD in the whole career. And even if they are seen by somebody who knows quite about neurological disease or CJD, in the early stages, the examination of the patient may reveal very little indeed, and it may well be that people have to wait and see what happens. So what about here? Once you've seen a specialist, say a neurologist, could it be that we could shorten the diagnostic time between this and making a possible or likely diagnosis and perhaps referral to either the surveillance unit or the National Prion Clinic? Could we reduce things? Well, I think you've got to understand why a specialist diagnosis takes time, even if you get to see a neurologist, and even a neurologist who might know about CJD. First of all, the presentation is very non-specific, as I've said, and as a neurologist, if you see somebody who's a bit forgetful, say, and unsteady, there are many causes for this, and many of them much commoner than CJD. This is a rare illness, CJD, and therefore statistically it's inherently unlikely that it will turn out to be CJD. Of course, it's a rare illness and the clinician may be unfamiliar with it and therefore find it a bit more difficult to recognize it. It's very important to understand it's fatal and untreatable, so clinicians want to be certain about the diagnosis. And of course, because other illnesses are possible, which may actually be treatable, you certainly don't want to miss those. You therefore undertake diagnostic tests, and they take time. And of course, on top of that, there are atypical forms of CJD, very unusual presentations of sporadic CJD, and these are rare expressions of an already rare disease, and that might make life a lot more difficult. And time itself might be a very important part of the diagnostic process. I've seen many people who have had illnesses which have looked like CJD at some point, but then has turned out to be something different, or indeed they've got better, and whatever it wasn't CJD. And the way in which the illness evolves over time may be a very important and intrinsic part of the diagnostic process. Now, of course, awareness of disease is important, and we quite often hear families say they didn't know anything about CJD, or we need to educate doctors and nurses about CJD. I have to say that in the UK and some other countries, BSc and variant CJD have an increased awareness of CJD in general to an enormous extent. Certainly when I was first interested in CJD in 1980, nobody really had ever heard of it, whereas now everybody to some degree has at least heard of it. But the real thing is you can't know everything. So there are many, many rare diseases, and I've diagnosed quite a number of rare diseases that at the time I first saw the patient, I knew nothing about them, or had never seen a case before, or had never heard of the disease. And of course you can be educated and given knowledge about diseases, but as you will all know, knowledge that's not used regularly simply fades. So somebody might be taught about CJD and then 5 years later remember very little about it indeed. So in my view, and this is a personal view, specific education about rare diseases is not fundamentally the answer in the end. What you should expect from medical services is that they should recognize serious illness, even if they don't know what it is. They should know how to obtain helpful information and advice. And when I've seen, for example, the diseases that I mentioned, other than CJD, very rare ones that I didn't know anything about, I knew who to ask about this kind of problem, and then generally got some very helpful information and advice. And you should be able to refer on to specialists in a timely manner, and even within a speciality like neurology, to seek subspeciality advice in a timely manner. And through all of this, as time goes by and families and other people are very uncertain about what's going on and very worried, you should know how to support people in uncertain and worrying situations. This is a graph which it's difficult to interpret, and what I really want to do is just to look at the area with the blue arrows. It represents a certain period of time, and the data here is a little bit fuzzy, but I just want to just illustrate something. If you look at the two grey columns, these are people who were referred to the UK surveillance system as being thought to possibly have sporadic CJD by neurologists. And the blue columns next to them are the proportion of those referrals who turned out to have sporadic CJD. And what you can see is that in 1996 and 1997, a relative minority of people who were referred actually had sporadic CJD. On the other hand, if you go forward in time to 2008 and 2009, you see that actually of those people referred to us with the suspicion of sporadic CJD, a significant greater number of them actually did have sporadic CJD. And that suggests to me that on the whole, there is better recognition of CJD cases by general neurologists and a reduction in the referral of non-cases proportionately. So UK clinicians actually have improved in diagnosis of sporadic CJD. And this is probably because of increased awareness. It's probably because of better education, although I would maintain it's probably general better education rather than specifically about CJD. And of course, the development in diagnostic tests, because over this time, diagnostic tests have definitely improved. So the clinical diagnostic process from a neurologist's point of view is that first of all, you see someone with a neurological illness, you have to think of the diagnosis, you have to exclude other diagnoses that are possible, and then you rely on confirmatory tests for the diagnosis that you're interested in. Now, of course, other diagnoses are possible when you see somebody with sporadic CJD, and some of these are potentially treatable. And therefore, you really do need to go into things in detail not to miss these treatable diseases. So inevitably, certain blood tests will be done, MRI scans will be done, spinal fluid examinations will be done, and all of these take time to do, and they all take time to get the results. In doing this kind of essential work, it's very easy for 1 or 2 weeks to go by. Just looking at the confirmatory tests for the diagnosis of sporadic CJD, just as an historical note, the EEG was the one that we had to rely on alone. So in 1980, that was about it. And then, of course, we had the CSF 1433 protein test. And then alongside that, very closely, has come the brain MRI. And although the 1433 test and the MRI are very useful indeed in the diagnosis of sporadic CJD, none of these tests show abnormalities that are unique to sporadic CJD. They can show abnormalities which are seen in other diseases. They can be very helpful, but they're not based on the fundamental disease process. And so in essence, they are non-specific. Of course, what's actually happened has been the development of a number of tests, and in particular for sporadic CJD, the CSF-RT quick test, which is based on a natural disease mechanism. And there are other tests in development and assessment, and this has no doubt helped the diagnosis of CJD by neurologists a lot. But I would stress to you that tests alone can never solve a diagnostic problem. Tests have to be used and their results interpreted in the right way, at the right time, in the right people. They can never replace the diagnostic process entirely. So this is just something about sporadic CJD in the United Kingdom, and it's just an overall summary of time. And this is a graph showing the symptom onset, the time between the symptom onset and the referral to either ourselves or the National Prem Clinic, or in effect, both of us. And if you go through the whole thing from 1990, 98 to 2008, you'll see that the median time from the first symptom to referral to one of our specialist units has not really changed at all, despite the advances in diagnostic techniques. So UK clinicians have improved in CJD diagnosis, in my view. I think that they are better at identifying these cases in general, and the diagnostic tests have improved. But what that's done, I think, has led to better identification of cases and increased certainty in the diagnosis. But actually, it's had relatively little impact on the time to referral to specialist units, nor on the time to the final clinical diagnosis. Just to show you how difficult it can be, this relates to 2008. The situation is not substantially different, but this is a pie chart relating to suspected sporadic CJD referrals that were seen, these cases seen by our unit, the National CJD Research and Surveillance Unit, in 2008. And this is at the time they were actually seen by staff from the unit who were very experienced in CJD. So this is quite late down the line of the illness. And of those, we had 85 cases in this analysis for 2008, and about 55% of them were thought by our staff to have sporadic CJD. However, they all thought nearly a quarter of these patients did not have CJD. Even at this stage, it was it turned out not to be CJD. But the important thing was that in nearly a quarter, there was still uncertainty. So even at this late stage, with experienced CJD staff, there was uncertainty about the diagnosis in nearly a quarter of the people seen. And if you take this quarter, roughly about 2/3 of this quarter were finally in the end sporadic CJD, but that means that about 1/3 of them were not. And this really just goes to show, I think, how difficult the diagnosis can be, even by very experienced people, and how careful you have to be to make sure the diagnosis is correct. Now, of course, those of you who've gone through this business with family members or friends will know that, of course, that your family member or your friend had sporadic CJD. And therefore, it seems in a way very clear cut that in the end, that was the diagnosis. But this is someone presenting with a particular symptom, symptom X, and they're seen, and there are all sorts of general possibilities, and the neurologist or GP or whoever sees them thinks there may be 6 possible causes for this. And at this point in time, they don't know which. In the end, however, eventually one cause is decided upon, for example, sporadic CJD. And once you've done that, you can see the pathway by which this conclusion was reached. And it looks indeed extremely clear. Obviously, you've just gone through this and come out with the diagnosis. And then, of course, you could look backwards along this path and say, well, it was obvious. And symptom X is indeed a very classic symptom of CJD. And so really, shouldn't we have seen that from the beginning? But actually, prospectively, there are many possibilities, and you can't know this from the outset. So if you know the solution to a maze, it's very easy to see where you've come in and how you've got there. But when you enter the maze for the first time, you don't know the answer. So I just thought I'd finish with 2 illustrative histories. I've abstracted them from some time ago, so they won't be identified in any way. This is an 83-year-old man who turned out to have definite sporadic CJD. He first sought advice 3 weeks after his first symptom. And if you look at the total illness duration, it was 11 weeks. So actually, you're talking here about nearly a quarter of the way through the illness before this person thought it was reasonable to seek any kind of advice at all. He was referred to a neurologist at 4 weeks, so the GP acted very quickly, and indeed the neurologist acted very quickly, and they were seen at 5 weeks. And then they were admitted to hospital even at 6 weeks. And shortly after admission, a few days after admission, they had a brain MRI and CJD was first suspected. But at this point, we were already over halfway through the illness. And then very shortly after that, notified to our unit and seen by our unit, but then died at 11 weeks. So you can see that the diagnosis was made relatively late on in the illness, but it's very difficult to know in this case how it could have been done any sooner. This is a 67-year-old lady who had definite sporadic CJD, and she didn't go to see a doctor at all until 8 weeks into the illness. And the reason for that was because her original symptoms were very non-specific, and indeed there was no suggestion of any form of cognitive impairment, one of the hallmarks of CJD, even up to 12 weeks into the illness. Therefore, things were proceeding rather slowly and very non-specifically at first. She was admitted to hospital eventually at 14 weeks, where things had become quite clear. She'd now for 2 weeks had some cognitive difficulties. Referred to a neurologist almost immediately, seen by a neurologist almost immediately, where CJD was first suspected, and then notified to our unit and seen within a week, but died at 20 weeks. And so you can see here that actually things moved along really pretty slowly in the beginning phases because of non-specific symptoms and really very difficult to know what was going on. But when she actually got into proper medical hands, the whole process moved very quickly. But again, unfortunately, the diagnosis actually only really being suspected very late on in the illness. So what I've really been trying to say is that diagnosis takes time, and one has to take the time to some degree because the presentations are non-specific and although it's very clear if somebody presents with, say, unsteadiness and forgetfulness, that they have sporadic CJD, you can say, well, of course, sporadic CJD does typically present like that. But virtually nobody in general practice who has these symptoms ever turns out to have CJD. And some passage of time is necessary sometimes in order to see whether these symptoms progress in the right kind of way. And the whole process in the end must take some time, during which, of course, there is a lot of uncertainty and difficulty for patients and families. I certainly appreciate that. This uncertainty, however, affects not only the patient and the family and the friends, it also affects the clinical staff. And I think what you really want from medical services is, of course, to do everything as efficiently as possible, but also to try to practice in a sympathetic and supportive way during this time of great uncertainty. So I'll finish at this point with a view of the iconic rail bridge.